People from low socio-economic areas are the worst hit by environmental damage and health inequalities, and therefore any solutions that we come up with to these complex problems must be for those groups. If you would like to know more information about the Triple Win, please contact EP Scotland after today's event, and they can put you in touch with Professor George Morris, who's a trustee for EP Scotland and whose brainchild these webinars are. Today's first webinar is going to focus on air quality, as today is Clean Air Day. Clean Air Day in Scotland is organised by Claire, John and Elena at Environmental Protection Scotland, and I'm sure you'll agree that they undertake that role excellently. This year they have developed a radio and television ad. Claire was trying to show you the TV ad as you were coming in, and hopefully we'll get a chance to look at that later. You might also have heard John on Radio Scotland this morning just before 9 o'clock talking about Clean Air Day and what we can all do to reduce our emission footprint. Clean Air Day was launched in 2017 and normally takes place in June. However, as we know all too well, COVID-19 has changed the world from what it was at the start of the year. And now Scotland's come together to support Clean Air Day in a way that was unthinkable 7 months ago. From the Black Isle, Skye and Inverness in the Highlands, down to Aberdeen, Dundee, Glasgow and Edinburgh, and down to the borders in Dumfries and Galloway, scores of people, dozens of schools, charities, private sector, local authorities and other groups are supporting the campaign. And it highlights the efforts by the government and local authorities to make Scotland's air quality the best in Europe through low emission zones, active travel, and support for cleaner bus fleets and electric vehicles. And all this links in with the Scottish Government's ambition to reduce its share of global greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2045. This year, the organisers have shifted Clean Air Day onto social media, with schools still participating in air quality and active travel activities across Scotland and the UK. There has been involvement from the Dunbar Harbour Trust, which has promoted a no idling messages to visitors, to Transport Scotland, which supported Enterprise Car Club's decision to make its electric vehicles available for customers free of charge today. There's also been support from across the political spectrum, with the Green Party MSP Mark Russell tabling a motion for today in the Scottish Parliament to recognise Clean Air Day. Highland Council's also hearing a motion today at its COVID-19 recovery meeting, instigated by the Conservative councillor Isabel Mackenzie in support of the campaign. So the campaign urges people to walk, cycle or scoot instead of using the car, and aims to keep up some of that air quality improvements which emerged during the recent lockdown that took place in March and April. And Clean Air Day has tapped into the public's enthusiasm for cycling and walking, which enjoyed a bounce that's still being felt after the rules about staying in your local area forced people out to exercise during the lockdown. The £30 million provided by Transport Scotland's Spaces for People and administered by Sustrans Scotland to local authorities for temporary walking and cycling routes during the pandemic across towns has made the difference, with people feeling safer and more socially distant. Cycling Scotland's own data from its cycle counters across Scotland found that there's been a 199% increase in cyclists passing one of the counters in Clyde Street in Glasgow between the start of lockdown and by the end of September. And the charity recorded a 132% rise at its counter in Dunfermline and a 128% rise in cyclists passing the roadside counter in Newton Mearns. LEZ cities have transformed for pedestrians and cyclists, and 15 months after a street in George Square in Glasgow was sealed off to traffic for people to enjoy food at a picnic table on Clean Air Day, pub goers could be seen enjoying a drink on socially distanced benches laid out across a normally busy street overlooking the square. And the LEZ, which was initially for buses, the Next Bike Hire scheme, the Avenues cycle scheme and bus-only streets to speed up our bus services are all helping to push people out of their cars onto active travel within Glasgow. And last week, the City Council announced the Parkhead Cross Air Quality Management Area has been revoked after nitrogen dioxide levels in the AQMA consistently met the air quality objectives. This all follows the Scottish Government's programme for government announcement on September the 1st that £500 million would be invested in active travel infrastructure across Scotland over the next 5 years. And in a statement to mark Clean Air Day, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate and Rural Affairs, Rosanna Cunningham, has said, "Reducing air pollution is vital to the health of our people and planet, and here in Scotland, we want to make the air we breathe the cleanest in Europe. Leaving our cars at home and opting to walk or cycle instead is a simple way to reduce air pollution, keep fit, and help Scotland reach its goal of ending our contribution to climate change by 2045. Ms. Cunningham has also recorded a video which will start our webinar.
I'm delighted to be opening Environmental Protection Scotland's Clean Air Day 2020 webinar. Under normal circumstances, of course, there'd be events the length and breadth of Scotland to mark Clean Air Day. And I've had the pleasure of attending some of these events in previous years in Edinburgh and Glasgow. But like so much else in our daily lives this year, we're having to do things very differently. Environmental Protection Scotland has put in a huge amount of work to ensure that Clean Air Day can still take place in these difficult circumstances, and I want to offer my thanks for this effort. The air that we breathe is fundamental to human life and the quality of our environment. The quality of our lives is placed at both short and longer term risk by poor air quality, and this has been brought into sharp perspective by the COVID-19 pandemic, because emerging evidence does suggest a possible association between air pollution and both exacerbated symptoms and mortality levels attributed to COVID-19. It is, of course, still too early to draw any firm conclusions as this area of research is continuing to evolve, but will need to be watched. The pandemic has changed the way we work, socialise and, of course, travel. These unprecedented changes in living and working patterns are likely to have had and will continue to have a significant impact on air pollution. In the short term, at the height of lockdown, we saw big decreases in pollution levels in many urban areas. Whilst these circumstances do not make it a cause for celebration, it does show how quickly air quality can improve. We must learn lessons from this experience to deliver similar air quality improvements over the longer term in a sustainable and viable way, particularly given that pollution levels have started to rise again as lockdown measures have been eased. Despite the undoubted improvements in air quality over recent years, it is clear that continued and systemic action will be required to ensure we are addressing known and emerging risks. Scotland is generally performing well by UK, European and global comparison, with both ambient concentrations and mass emissions of the main air pollutants largely continuing to fall as a result of actions taken to date, both nationally and internationally. More remains to be done though, not least as we better understand the impacts of air pollution on human health and the natural environment. It's therefore timely that we are preparing to launch a public consultation on our proposals for a new air quality strategy to build on the legacy of Cleaner Air for Scotland. I launched the independently led review of Cleaner Air for Scotland in November 2018, and the purpose of this was twofold. Firstly, to assess progress to date in implementing the actions contained in the strategy, and secondly, to identify priorities for additional actions to deliver further air quality improvements. The review, which was led admirably by Professor Campbell Gemmell, produced a comprehensive list of recommendations to build on achievements to date. It is these recommendations that form the basis of our proposals. To maximise the benefits from action to tackle poor air quality, it is essential that we build on the linkages with other key policies. Since Cleaner Air for Scotland was published in 2015, we have introduced some of the most ambitious legislation in the world to end Scotland's contribution to climate change by 2045, published our environment strategy, which emphasises the fundamental role our natural environment plays in supporting a fairer, healthier, more inclusive society, updated our national transport strategy, and of course taken major steps to reform Scotland's planning system. And all of this is necessary if we are to secure our vision of Scotland having the best air quality in Europe, air quality that aims to protect and enhance health, well-being, and of course the environment. Although there is still much to do, it is important that we do recognise our very real achievements to date. Although air pollution hotspots remain in some of our cities and towns, data from our Scotland-wide air quality monitoring network shows a sustained year-on-year improvement across the country. This is in no small part due to the sustained efforts of many organisations and individuals in both the public and private sectors. It serves to underline one of the key Clean Air Day messages, which is that we can all help to improve air quality in our neighbourhoods. Even small changes to our everyday behaviour can have a big impact locally, and Clean Air Day is an important focus for showing the various actions that we can take. I'm sure that this year's events will be a tremendous success under challenging circumstances. Together, we can make a difference.
So my thanks to Ms. Cunningham for providing that video and introduction to today's webinar. So I'm now going to hand over to our first presentation. But before we do, remember you can post your questions in the chat function. You can find the chat function down at the bottom of your screen when you're looking for it. If you don't want to ask the question publicly, you can send it privately to me and I'll capture it and ask on your behalf. So first up is Thomas Haddock. Thomas is the Infrastructure Coordinator for Sustrans Scotland, and he's been there for the last 4 years, having previously been embedded within the active travel team at the City of Edinburgh Council. In 2019, he moved to the Places for Everyone team, where he managed partnerships in Dundee, East Ayrshire, South Ayrshire, and Dumfries and Galloway. His academic background is in sustainability development, and he has spent the last 6 years working in active travel, having also previously worked for social enterprise in London called Bikeworks. His presentation, Richard is going to provide an overview of the Places for Everyone team and how Sustrans ties into the air quality debate. He's going to talk about a case study based in Dundee with a particular focus on the Broughty Ferry project before finishing talking about the relevance of the 20-minute neighbourhoods. Thomas, I'll pass to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ian. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Right. Great. Well, thanks, Ian, and thanks for having me here today. As Ian said, I'm working the Place for Everyone team from Sustrans, and for anyone who's not aware, Sustrans is a cycling and walking charity. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what Place for Everyone is, where we've come from, and how Sustrans links into the wider air quality debate before touching on Broughty Ferry with a bit of a wider case study on what's been going on in Dundee. And finally, we're going to finish up with a little bit of a chat about 20-minute neighbourhoods, what they are and how they also fit into the puzzle. So just to start off, as you can see here, we've got the very high level design sort of guidance for the Places for Everyone. And Places for Everyone is a Transport for Scotland funded programme that's managed by Sustrans. And we support our partners across Scotland to deliver cycling and walking infrastructure. And just to give you a bit of a history, Places for Everyone is about 2 years old now, and it was previously called Community Links and Community Links Plus. And I think even the change in language is quite telling in the journey we've gone on in the last sort of 5 years, particularly sort of connecting communities, getting people from A to B to now this more holistic idea of places and places for everyone. We still very much stick by one of the core principles that's been with Sustrans for a long time, which is facilitating independent walking, cycling and wheeling for everyone, including an unaccompanied 12-year-old. But now we realise the importance of taking that one step further and looking at our public realm, looking at our public spaces, and looking at the quality of public space. And then perhaps most relevant to air quality is that in order to get that modal shift from vehicle use to cycling and walking, we need to see that reallocation of road space and to restrict motor traffic permeability to prioritise people walking, cycling and wheeling. And so what are the benefits of active travel infrastructure and public space? Well, ultimately they're pretty obvious. It's improvements to the environment, the communities, and ultimately economies as well. But in order to get those rewards, we have to also see that modal shift. So that change from driving to cycling and walking. As I said, and that will lead us to more sustainable cities. Particularly stronger economies both locally and nationally. Analysis for the Trade Union Congress recently concluded that cycling and walking infrastructure is one of the best economic recovery investments the UK could make right now in the face of rebuilding after COVID. And that very much aligns with this idea about green jobs being developed. And it's also why back in May, the UK government allocated £2 billion to cycling and walking improvements in the face of COVID and also post-COVID. And now in Scotland at the moment, we've seen a 5-year investment confirmed in the programme released earlier this month, which is hopefully going to be bigger than previous years. And it's currently being negotiated between the Greens and the SNP exactly what the value of that would be. We've then got the environmental enhancements, which, first of all, improved air quality comes under that as well and reduced emissions, but also we have an opportunity now to really embed green infrastructure, sustainable urban drainage into our projects, and places for everyone aims to get an ecological net gain on most of our projects, but sometimes that can be quite challenging. I think it's an area that we need to improve on. And finally, we can get that stronger, more equitable communities. I think, again, one of the results of the COVID is we've realized how important it is to have these strong communities, and we've been seeing our city centres particularly lose communities over the last couple of decades. But by improving active travel and public space, we can reinvigorate communities. It's also about equity as well, and equitable communities. Air quality is often worse in low SIMD areas, where paradoxically car ownership is often low as well. So it's sort of rebalancing our urban spaces. And so that's where Places for Everyone's coming at, but that Sustrans are also involved in the air quality debate at sort of more in different ways as well. And I just wanted to play this video. It highlights where we're coming from, and Sustrans worked with Eunomia, who are a sustainability consultant, to develop this model, which is the first of its kind, which measures the benefits that shifting from cycling to walking can have on air quality. So I'll just let the video speak for itself.
Shifting everyday travel away from cars to walking and cycling can improve air quality around us. Fewer cars on roads means less emissions like nitrogen dioxide from car exhausts and particulate matter from brakes and tyres. For every 10 micrograms per cubic meter increase in the pollutant PM2.5, the risk of premature deaths increases by 6%. We've developed a model that can quantify air quality benefits from both reducing emissions due to fewer car journeys and changes in personal exposure to air pollution. Governments have set targets to increase the number of people cycling and walking. Doubling bike trips and increasing walking in England would prevent over 830 premature deaths from air pollution and save the economy 567.
Oh, sorry, seemed to have stopped there. Let me see if I can just get that back.
Shifting everyday travel away from cars, like in Scotland's cycling action plan, would prevent 394 premature deaths from air pollution and save the economy £364 million per year. In total, this would save the economy £9 billion over 10 years. The conclusion is clear. We must reduce the number of motor vehicles on our roads to improve air quality. Creating a network of protected cycle routes on main roads that are linked to quieter routes is one of the best ways to get more people on bikes and reduce road traffic. Visit sustrans.org.uk/air quality.
Okay, I think that just highlights the sort of the financial impact that improving our air quality can have. It's also this model, I think it's great, this creates this quantifiable data that can really help the conversation and can really give evidence to support making big decisions and signing off big projects. And then this moves me on to Broughty Ferry. So I was asked to talk a bit about Broughty Ferry, which is a project I've been involved in Dundee, and it's running along the waterfront. It's the biggest active travel project in Dundee at the moment, with a new 4-kilometre safe route with significant amounts of placemaking and public realm improvements. It's also going to be delivering the first section of segregation, as you can see in this drawing, in this visualization, the first section of segregation that Dundee will have. I wanted to show you this one drawing here because I think it shows probably one of the most ambitious elements of the project. And this is Wimble Gardens, which as it currently stands acts as a sort of roundabout. And the project's reallocating that south side of the carriageway and giving that back to active travel and to public space. This visualization here, again, it makes Dundee look a little bit more like Miami, but it does show the ambition to get have really good public realm, tagging on art, improving access to the beach. And overall, I'm extremely supportive of this project, and it's been great to be involved. And I think it will become a real gem for Dundee, and it will become a real destination for people to go to. And it will also make it easier for those people who are commuting between Angus and Dundee. However, in terms of actually achieving modal shifts, I don't think this project actually delivers. Well, its scope was never to deliver that. The reason being is that we don't have those onward connections, we don't have those onward routes. And I think this visualization really sort of really summarize that nicely, because you can see we've got the car park just behind, which takes up the majority of the visualization. And the reason that car park is there is because for lots of people who don't live in the close vicinity, there is not the cycling and walking infrastructure for them to access this piece of infrastructure, and therefore they have to drive or take public transport. But it is very ambitious for Dundee to get that segregation in, and I see this very much as a gateway project, which will show the benefits of it and then sort of open some doors to getting more ambitious projects that tackle some of the SIMD areas in Dundee, tackle some of the more polluted streets in Dundee. But Dundee are really doing everything right that we'd expect to see, which is the kind of things we were seeing Edinburgh doing a couple of years ago, which is they've refreshed their active travel strategy. They've set some clear objectives, some clear goals. And active travel strategies are so important in leveraging the delivery of projects, particularly if it can be ratified by committee. They've also declared a climate emergency, as with many local authorities. I work with a number that have declared a climate emergency, and I've yet to see that actually trickle down into greasing the wheels of Places for Everyone project delivery, but I'm hoping that we will see that focus. And finally, Dundee are also promoting their low emission zone, which as far as I'm aware is not too far off getting over the line, although it will be within the inner city bypass, which is sort of sums it up as well, that Dundee having this inner city bypass, it's outer city bypass, and it also has two of the most polluted streets in Scotland for nitrogen dioxide, 2 out of the 6 routes at Seagate and Lochie. So there's a long way for Dundee to go, but the foundations that are being built now and the projects that are being delivered now are going to really be the start of something quite big over the next 10 years. And I wanted to talk about Union Street, which is part of the Spaces for People Fund, which Ian mentioned earlier, which is again a Transport Scotland funded programme, which is being managed by Sustrans and is for improving social distancing as a result of COVID. And Union Street in Dundee has been a huge success. And it's been really great to be involved in. You can see here that 84% of traders have said the change has been positive, 62% saying it has been good for their business. And this is a city centre high street where there's been semi-pedestrianised. And I imagine, not that we don't have data, but I imagine the air quality for this street in particular would have been significantly improved. But we talked about it this is a quote here from Lord Mayor Sally Capp, and I think it highlights this thing we were talking about, in that everyone's been talking about the new normal. We're going to have this new normal where we've reclaimed our streets, and we've seen our streets in this great new light, but then slowly we can see that sort of new normal slipping away and just going back to the old normal. Whereas Union Street, and as Sally Capp says, we don't leverage these moments to make material change, we are crazy. And so therefore it's great to see that Union Street has now been extended its trial period until January. We can see them really take advantage of this opportunity, and hopefully in the long term, it'll become permanent. So finally, I just wanted to talk about this concept of what a 20-minute neighbourhood is. And the reason why I particularly wanted to add this on at the end is that in the Scottish programme that was released on the 1st of September, there is a real focus on active travel, which is great. But in particular, there's a focus on this concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. This is a model that's built on other models, sort of like this thing called the 15-minute city, which is something that is being embraced in Paris. But the 20-minute neighbourhood has been promoted by Sustrans Scotland for a while now, and it's seen as a key step in meeting Scotland's ambitious climate targets. So it's great to see it being adopted. And ultimately, what it is the concept of having all your basic needs: shops, health centres, work hubs, places to socialise within a 20-minute walk, cycle, or wheel. And in this way, we can create livable cities and towns for everyone. We can significantly improve air quality. We can significantly improve public health, and we can hit that triple win that we've been talking about in this today. And I think this 20-minute neighbourhood is really needed to be embedded within strategy and policy. Transport for Better Homes research for the UK that 18 out of 20 recently built housing developments have been designed solely around the car and promote car dependency. And I work with a number of local authorities where we've been involved in master planning for new developments, and a lot of them follow the NRDG standards, which is common practice. And the NRDG standards say that for a 4-bedroom house, you need to have 3 spaces as a minimum, and 3 parking spaces. And the argument for this is that reducing parking spaces doesn't reduce car ownership. And they're probably right. If you take those as 2 standalone things, they're probably right. But what they should be saying, if you want to have less than 3 parking spaces, you have to make the development more livable. And this means streets that prioritize people, significant amounts of green space, treating the cars as guests in the space, and public transport being easily accessible, which I think is a really big one. And children feel safe to play and travel to school. And this is something I'm particularly interested in, is this idea of designing around the child. That ultimately children have the same risks as us, which is ultimately death or injury from air pollution or from vehicle impacts. They're just more at risk of it. So if we're catering for them, we're actually going to improve it for all generations. And this has proven to be really successful in places like Rotterdam and Bogota. Okay, and so just to conclude, for Places for Everyone, our aim is to create safe, attractive, healthier places by increasing the number of trips made by cycling, walking, and wheeling for everyday journeys. And if we do this, our byproduct of achieving this is not only can we improve public health, we can improve air quality, we can also make more livable urban spaces. The last point I want to touch upon is electric vehicles, which will undoubtedly come up in the debate of air quality, and they're 100% support that there will be a place for electric vehicles in our future, in a sustainable future, and for essential journeys. But our argument for our urban spaces is that we need to see fewer, not just cleaner vehicles. And if we do think of electric vehicles as being a silver bullet, we will still end up designing our urban spaces for vehicles and not people. As soon as we can take that paradigm shift and really embrace on a national level that idea of designing for people, then that's when we will hit that triple win of health, well-being, equity, and long-term sustainability. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I've had a couple of questions for you, so you might want to put your camera back on. So from Alec McLean, he's asking, can we get data on changes in pollution to Union Street? So do you have that available?
We don't have that currently available. I think it's a very good point. And so far, the monitoring and evaluation has been focused on vendor feedback, but I think getting the data on air quality will be essential going forward.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question on that one. You said that the traders on Union Street have been positive with the trial. What about members of the public? Have you talked to them?
There's a piece of work that's being done at the moment by Dundee Council, which has been giving interviews on the street. So I'm sure when that comes out, we'll have some more information on that.
And another question from David Connelly, one of our future speakers, has asked in regard to the 20-minute neighbourhood, how easy is it to retrofit in an existing area as compared to starting a new development from scratch?
Yes, that's a very good question. It's very challenging to retrofit an existing area, but it is possible, and it's being done really successfully in Paris at the moment with with their 15-minute idea instead of 20 minutes. But the reason why I sort of focus on new developments when I was talking about 20-minute neighborhoods there is because they're blank slates, easy win opportunities that we're missing. I think the work that we're already doing in existing urban spaces will hopefully start to create these 20-minute neighbourhoods. But now that it's being more embedded into the Scottish Government programme, I think there's going to have to be a lot of conversations about how we're going to retrofit that into our urban spaces.
Yeah. I've had a private message saying that the 20-minute places sounds great and should help build social cohesion, resilience and prosperity, particularly as we're trying to recover from COVID as we come out from it. Yeah. There is one more question, but I think it's more relevant to a group discussion later on to do with how we collaborate and move into COP 26. So unless there are any more questions for Thomas at the moment, which there's not, so thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Carly Woods. Carly is a PhD student at the University of the West of Scotland, and she's working within the BREATH programme, which is an SEUBB funded consortium focusing on the study of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. Her project in particular focuses on air pollution components and the effects of health and COPD lung epithelia. And luckily for Carly, I'm her PhD supervisor. She's got no pressure when she's giving this presentation. Carly's talk's going to focus on the summary of the aims and some findings from her research to date. It's going to centre on the investigation into pollution profiles from focus regions that have elevated levels of COPD and the study of pollution components on lung epithelial. Carly, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, just a second. Okay, thank you, Ian. My name is, as he said, Carly Woods. I'm from the University of the West of Scotland, and my talk today is going to focus on air quality in semi-rural areas and COPD, specifically an investigation into particulate matter on lung epithelia with site-specific air pollution analysis. So I'm part of the Border and Regions Airways Training Hub. This is an Interreg VA funded programme which spans 3 institutions: Dundalk Institute of Technology, Queen's University of Belfast, and where I'm based, the University of the West of Scotland. It consists of 19 PhD students, 8 postdoctoral research assistants and research assistants, and 9 principal investigators. And the central focus of this consortium is to look at chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So for anyone that hasn't heard about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease before, it's a term used to encompass 2 main conditions. So you have chronic bronchitis, where inflammation leads to constriction of the bronchial smooth muscle and the mucus hypersecretion, and this can lead to narrowing of the airways. And then also emphysema, where alveolar membrane breakdown can lead to ineffective gas exchange at the terminal bronchioles. And this can lead to symptoms such as breathlessness and productive cough. So approximately 20% of COPD cases are not caused by, are not linked with smoking, although smoking is the predominant link with development of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And there's also a confirmed association between elevated levels of air pollution and development of COPD in the UK. So we have 2 main focus regions. These are Dumfries and Galloway and Ayrshire. And the reason why we're focusing on these regions is that there's some evidence to suggest that there's higher levels of COPD within these areas, as you can see here. And also, and this is particularly apparent for our main focus region in Stranraer, there's an correlation between Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation and COPD admissions. Our area has a decile 1 quantile 1 score. So the hypothesis of this study is that singularly and combined pollution components from semi-rural COPD hotspot focus regions can induce changes within lung epithelia, which can contribute to COPD pathogenesis. So we have two main aims. The first aim is that we want to look at air pollution within the area, and we want to get an idea of the pollution profile of this area. So we want to do this by measuring the air pollution with an AQ mesh, and we want to also obtain physical pollution samples using low volume samplers. We then want to identify the pollution profile and compare this to air quality limits. And then we want to analyse the sample content. So we want to use inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry and get an idea of the metal component of PM. And then this information will allow us to identify source apportionment, and also as a subset of this, because our monitor was out during the lockdown period, we wanted to see if there was any air pollution changes before and during the implementation of the lockdown. Our second aim focuses on the application of components of particulate matter and also a diesel engine particulate standard material onto epithelia. So we have bronchial epithelial Bs2B cells that we were looking at, and alveolar cells A549. These are common cells used when looking at lung epithelia and COPD. And then after the application of these components and standard material, we wanted to determine the effects of these on cytotoxicity, and also we wanted to use enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, or ELISA, and this is an assay that we can use to determine pro-inflammatory cytokines, so to determine whether there's inflammation in the area, and also determine the effects, therefore, on lung epithelia. So our first methodology, we placed our AQ mesh within Gordon Street in Paisley, and we calibrated it against the monitor here. And then we placed the AQ mesh at the cross section of Church Street and Sun Street in Stranraer. For our before period, we had the 17th of February to the 8th of March. We put a 2-hour period, 3 weeks here, 2-week period before and after the implementation of the lockdown to take into account the start of the social distancing measures, and also the 6th of April to the 26th of April we took as our during lockdown period. So when we found we collated the data from NO2 and ozone, and we found that there was a slight increase in a slight significant increase in Friday and Saturday measurements, and we also found that this, when collated together, there looked like there was a slight but significant increase during the period of the lockdown. But we think that this is because of spatiotemporal changes during this time. We found no change in ozone, so this would further indicate that this change is due to changes in spatiotemporal conditions. So for our second methodology, as I was saying before, we applied bronchial and alveolar cells. We grew them in monolayer with cell culture medium, and we applied 0.1 to 1,000 micrograms per mil of iron and zinc ions in the form of metal salts. And we used diesel engine particulate standard material, and we applied that at 0.5 and 5 micrograms per mil. And the reason that we use those concentrations is the literature suggests that they're more equivalent to real life exposures of a heavily polluted area. And following 24 hours, we performed an MTT assay, which is a metabolism assay on the cells, which is just generally used to identify cell death. And then we did the ELISA with the IL-6 from the medium from this. So following our zinc and iron exposure to the alveolar and bronchial epithelia, we found that there was a dose-dependent decrease in cell viability. So concluding at 100 micrograms per mil for zinc, and we found a similar trend in the bronchial epithelia, but we didn't see a similar trend in iron. Iron seemed ineffective at reducing cell viability. The cell death that you see at 1,000 micrograms per mil is more due to the pH of the conditions caused at this high concentration. And then, as we can see with the pH-dependent cell viability decrease, there was an increase in cytokines, but we also found that when we had viable cells, there was also an increase in IL-6 at 100 picograms per mil of IL-6 and 100 micrograms per mil of iron. And then we also found this in the A549 exposed to zinc. There was no observed IL-6 increase in zinc exposed Bs2B. And then when we looked at the diesel engine particulate exposure to Bs2B, and we've only done this at Bs2B at this time, but there was no reduction in cell viability with the realistic concentrations of diesel engine particulates. But we did find that after 24 hours exposure that we had an increase in IL-6 production of 1.5, and we found that it was over twofold higher in 5 micrograms per mil exposed diesel engine particulates, and this was significant. So to conclude, the studied pollution values that we saw with NO2 and ozone were below the Scottish air quality limits. We found that our NO2 concentrations slightly increased and ozone remained constant during the lockdown period. But as I said, this is likely due to temperature and wind direction, among other conditions. And metal ions display differential cytotoxic action on our lung epithelial cell line. Our ions induced IL-6 release from A549 and Bs2B, and a realistic dose exposure of cells with diesel engine particulates did not affect cell viability, but did increase a low but significant increase in IL-6. So in the future, we want to build a picture of particulate matter emissions within the area, and we want to do that by getting physical particulate matter samples. We want to potentially obtain data from another AQ mesh network within one of our focus regions to see how the air pollution changed during lockdown and how this compares to the results that we found. We want to expand metal ion studies and look at other metals, but also metals in combination to see if there's a greater effect. We want to further investigate healthy and COPD diseased human bronchial epithelial cells, because the cells that we're using just now are a cancer cell line and also adenovirus transformed cell line. So these would be a better representation of healthy and COPD diseased human bronchial epithelial cells that we'll be able to get from patients. And we want to use biologically relevant models of lung epithelia. So namely, we want to use an air-liquid interface culture, which is better representative of the lung epithelia within the airways. And we want to obtain site-specific particulate matter samples, and we want to characterize these and determine the effect of site-specific samples on lung epithelia, as opposed to using diesel engine particulates, which are used in lieu of physical samples at the moment. And I just want to thank my supervisory team, my breath colleagues, the technicians at University of the West of Scotland, and the members of Renfrewshire Council who were able to help us with the placement calibration of the AQ mesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Carly. So there's been a couple of comments coming in on the chat for you. The first one being, in England, there's been a marked increase in ozone concentration since the 23rd of March at urban and especially roadside sites. The consensus view that this is due to the reduction in concentrations of NO, which is going to remove the ozone. And ozone concentrations do tend to be lower in Scotland, though. Do you have a comment on the ozone?
So during, we didn't see any increase in the ozone, but that's because the concentration change that we saw wasn't necessarily dependent on cycling of NO2 and ozone in the air, but rather changes within, as in there was, so from February was the windiest month since January 1980. The 6-week period during the lockdown has been in the top 0.1% of any 6-week period in terms of easterly winds. And spring 2020 has been the sunniest since records began. So all these changes have kind of masked any change that we might have seen, but it doesn't seem to be that there was a significant change in the area that we could observe.
Thanks, Carly, for that. And there's one other question from Alec. Could you get data from, example, like exhaled air from patients?
So the patient samples that we have are bought in from ATCC or Lonza companies. So we don't directly work with patients, so we wouldn't be able to get that data.
Okay, thanks. And there'll be lots of different things we have to fill in to get and undertake that. But it's important to know what this project is. It's over 3 different institutions, and there are lots of different people working in different aspects. If there's no more questions, I obviously can't ask you a question because, well, I know the project. If there's no more questions for Carly, I'll say thanks to Carly, and then we'll move on to our final speaker, Dr. David Connelly, who has one of the best job descriptions I've ever come across, the Director of Innovation at Sistra Limited. David is a member of the EP Scotland Expert Advisory Group on air quality. He's the Director of Innovation at Sistra and has an expert in transport-related emissions and appraisal. Dr. Connelly's emissions-related experience includes the appraisal of emissions-related impacts on a wide range of land use plans, transport schemes and strategies. He's recently been closely involved in the design and delivery of a clean air zone for Sheffield and Rotherham, and has provided expert emissions-related advice on clean air zone studies for Derby, Greater Manchester, North Tyneside and Southampton. And he's been closely involved in developing, maintaining and using Sistra's emission modelling software over the last 23 years. David's talk's going to summarise some of the emerging findings from his recent research, including predictions on how new emission technologies, in particular related to battery electric vehicles, will affect the emissions characteristics of city centre traffic in the UK and Ireland, and understand and predict the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on traffic emissions. David, are you ready to share your camera? There we go. David, we can't hear you if you're chatting. You're still on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Is that
There we
better
go.
now? Yeah.
That's you. Grand.
Okay, yes. This will be quite a quick gallop through some of the work that we have been doing on clean air zones and low emission zones. I personally have been involved mainly in the clean air zones down south and in various cities, both the modelling and a lot of the consultation. But my colleagues are also working on low emission zones in Scotland, which we'll mention on the way past. But this presentation is focusing on both the English and the Scottish approach to low emission zones, and in particular the emission modelling that goes with that. So my presentation I'm going to summarise a bit of the background as quickly as I can, and I apologise that I have probably more material than I can get into the 20 minutes, so I will be galloping through it quite quickly, but the material is available and I'm very happy to take questions either as part of the chat later or as follow-up. So it'll be a fairly quick gallop through what we have been doing on low emission clean air zone. So a bit of the background, a bit of the issues to do with emissions modelling and what that entails, and then some of the challenges that we have faced and have generally overcome along over the past 2 to 3 years modelling work, and then a couple of nuggets of wisdom as my final slide. So next slide. I seem to have difficulty getting my slides to go forward. Give me a second. So right. So is it everybody's? I've stopped sharing.
Sorry, David, you've stopped sharing.
Yeah, I seem to be unable to share and move forward at the same time. So give me a little bit of a second. Zoom.
So we can see your screen now.
Yeah, it seems to be when I'm sharing, it is not allowing me to control the presentation.
So if you want to do it like that, if that saves you any hassle,
Or if I can I get you to, well, no, it's okay, I'll keep going. So yeah, so basically, yeah, we'll work with it just as the PowerPoint. So anyway, the low emission zone that are going on, and there are probably others that are not on this list. A lot of the major cities, obviously across the UK, the ones with a lot of traffic in the city centres in particular, and then the four at the bottom relevant to Scotland, Aberdeen, Dundee, and Edinburgh and Glasgow, where the technology is low emission zone rather than clean air zone. So I will be using the two terms interchangeably, but they're not. They're actually different, but it's the same basic idea. And we Sister have been working on either in terms of the modelling or the appraisal of all the ones with the green ticks. And I have been involved predominantly in the English ones, but with my keeping an eye on what my colleagues are up to in Scotland. So typically when we're talking about modelling, we Sister do a lot of the transport modelling, and that turns into traffic modelling and mode choice and so forth. And then what I have been doing in Sister over the past umpteen years is the emissions modelling off the back of the traffic models. And that emissions modelling then feeds through ultimately into air quality models and determines what the future air quality will be like if the traffic does X or Y and the fleet changes as determined by the clean air zone. So typically the questions that need to be answered by the modelling are what sort of, if you are introducing a CAS, what sort is it, what vehicles should be affected to achieve the required level of improved air quality, and not necessarily adding more charge and more cost than you need to achieve a given level of air quality. So, and the standard set are A, B, C, and D. So D is all motorised vehicles, C is everything except private, B is everything that was in C except the light van, the light goods, and then A is just buses, coaches, and taxis. So generally the plan is to work out what level of CAS is required, what boundary of the city should be included in the clean air zone, how much should be charged, and should residents or any other subsets of vehicle users get a discount on that daily charge. And in particular, where we come in is can we avoid creating more air quality problems than we solve? So if you introduce a scheme that generates a lot of traffic routing around a very small area, you might end up with more congestion and more pollution in the boundaries circulating traffic on roads that were not designed for orbiting traffic. So you need to make sure that your scheme is well designed, that you're not just pushing the air pollution round the zone onto diversionary routes. So that's the sort of questions we're aiming to answer in each of our studies. There's a big long list which I'm not going to go through. It's the sort of things that we need to do. So you need to make sure you have a traffic model and update the one you have. You need to look at the local fleet as to what mix of Euro standards are in that traffic and how many would be affected by the CAS. You then need to predict how that will change over time, because obviously the fleet's getting cleaner and so forth. The one that's of most interest to me is forecasting what the fleet, the vehicle owners, will do if you were to introduce a charge. So if you were to introduce, let's say, a CAS C affecting light goods vehicles, what proportion of the current traffic driving non-compliant LGVs will take their business somewhere else? What proportion will upgrade and what proportion will pay the charge where that's a daily charge, not a very high fine, basically? And that understanding that behavior is one of the hardest bits of the whole jigsaw to predict. And that was before COVID, and I'll come back to that question in a minute. So then, having identified your two fleets, the business as usual and the do something fleets in the future, then you can start modeling different zones and different charging regimes and come up with one that delivers what you need as cost effectively as possible. And at the final one on that is the appraisal is actually not straightforward, because a lot of the appraisal tools are not really at the moment designed or weren't designed to appraise schemes that were designed to get people to buy different vehicles or replace old vehicles with new vehicles, and it's the appraisal needs a bit more, or needed a bit more development. So that was what the various steps of a clean air zone were. A lot of the stuff in England we've worked with Ricardo, and in particular their rapid air, and I went past the step which is that once we have done our emission modeling, we feed those emissions into a dispersal model, which then predicts the air quality. And down south in England, we have been working with Ricardo, and in particular their rapid air has been used, and it's what takes the emissions either from our traffic model or wherever, and it ends up adding all the background and the chimneys and the power stations and whatever else, cruise liners in the port and all the other things that are adding to the air quality, and stir that all about and come up with predictions of future air quality. So rapid air is the one that they use, and obviously there are others, so ADMS. And I apologize to my SEPA colleagues, I should have had a slide in for what your dispersal modelling does in Scotland, but I didn't have time to speak to you. But certainly in Scotland, it's the SEPA dispersal model is the ones we're using in the 4 cities that we're doing LEZs for in Scotland. So what are the challenges that we have identified? Obviously, the first one is if you don't have a traffic model, you're not starting in a great place, because you need to understand the traffic and the fleet before you can start predicting how it will change. So you better have something that understands the traffic flows. You need to calibrate your local fleet, because different cities have different ages of fleet age profiles, and therefore different mixes of old and old pre-Euro 4 and older diesel in some areas. And even within the cities, that can vary. So you need to understand your local fleet. You need to predict how those local fleets will change over time. So that requires fleet modeling, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then how the hard one that I've talked about is how will the introduction of a low emission zone or a clean air zone affect the fleet? You can't just rely on the business as usual. People will change if they think there's a clean air zone coming, and they will then change again when the clean air zone is introduced. So how do you predict that? What affects that upgrade? So obviously, the closer you are to the clean air zone, the more likely it is you'll upgrade. The more frequently you travel within the charging area, the more likely you'll upgrade. The level of the charge will affect your chances, particularly when you're talking clean air zone, where it's just a daily charge, not a ban. And what are the various costs that feed into that in terms of your choices of which vehicle type you get. So there's quite a lot of complicated stuff needed to predict how people will respond in their fleet behavior. And generally, the speed that we were talking about in clean air zones, we didn't have time to build nice places with cycling and 20-minute neighborhoods and or things that you should be doing as part of an overall strategy, because the whole clean air zone thing is to get compliant in the shortest possible time. So you basically were more or less ruling out anything that needed to be built. Basically, it was very much focusing on the fleet just to get that quick improvement, to get rid of getting rid of diesel out of the fleet as much as you can, and certainly old diesel. And then there's another tricky bit, which I'll come on to, which is the all-day charge. A lot of traffic models are not well set up for modeling an all-day charge as opposed to a cordon crossing charge, and I'll try and explain very quickly what that issue is there. And then there's a whole set of complicated things to do with where the cordon is, what the charging is, and how the do something fleet changes in response to all of that. So basically, it was quite a tricky area, and non-standard modelling techniques were needed at nearly every step along the way. Other challenges was the emissions that we apply to the traffic need to keep up to date. So you need your COPERT latest version, and then you need to unpick that and apply it to your traffic modelling. Obviously you need your air quality models to include all those other things that are affecting the local air quality, not just the traffic. As I mentioned before, the appraisal of upgrading was missing. So how do you quantify the costs and benefits of upgrading a fleet, replacing an old vehicle with a new one? Understanding the links between frequency and vehicle renewal. Do we try and appraise what we're doing to the second-hand value of old vehicles? Do they all get dumped in Ireland, or do they just not get sold and therefore they stay in the fleet because they don't get sold on, and so forth? So the second-hand market for dirty diesel is an effect that you may or may not want to include in your overall appraisal of the strategy. And finally, the last thing we're going to get onto is the impact of COVID and all of this, because obviously that has come in just in the middle of the various cities trying to implement their favourite clean air zone. And the one last thing down at the bottom there is the emission factor toolkit. At various stages, we were being asked to use the emissions factor toolkit, which is the UK standard, and we were very sure that it was overestimating the percentage of diesel, probably because it was underestimating the cliff edge that percentage of diesel in new car sales has fallen over basically since 2016. So it's down. It used to be up about, it was over 50% of new sales were diesel 4 years ago, and it's now less than 20%. And the emissions factor toolkit was very behind the curve on that, and we had to keep arguing with Jack, the Joint Air Quality Unit, that our predictions of diesel sales feeding into the fleet were more accurate, and I think we've been proved right basically over time that every time they said that the diesel wasn't going to fall any further, we said it was, and it generally did when you get the next set of data coming through. And similarly, relating to that is the new fuel types, the EV, battery and hybrid, are growing probably quicker than were previously assumed. So basically the fleet's getting cleaner from the new end, basically across the UK and in cities where clean air zones are coming. Not going to talk about this slide, but there is a real difficulty with a model that focuses on home-based trips. So you go from home to work and back again in your vehicle, or you go from your depot to your customer and back, or whatever, or you make chains. But generally the models don't take account of the movements throughout the day of the same vehicle. So if you try and enforce a model of which is a pay once to drive about all day, a daily charge, it's actually quite tricky to do that in a way that reflects the boundary of the charging area correctly and the impact on mode choice in particular. So there was quite a bit of challenge in that area, which I haven't time to bore you with, so I will move swiftly on. Fleet modelling, again, a lot of the need to understand how the fleet is getting better on its own if you do nothing, and then calibrating what the do something will do to that fleet. And then when you've got that working and calibrated to your fleet and local data, you then throw COVID in on top of that in terms of nobody getting near a showroom for 6 months and then not having any money to upgrade their fleet even when they do get back out to a showroom. So the whole how COVID has affected the fleet modelling. But you do need to be modelling the fleet in this area, because that's the key question for clean air zones, is what happens to the fleet and how long do you need that to give the vehicle owners, and how much money do you need to wave at them to make them upgrade their vehicles, and what does that do to your emissions. So the whole understanding of fleet modelling is something that we have developed as part of our work, basically. And I'm, again, very happy to talk about that in more detail. And in particular, if you have an area where there's an out migration of dirty diesel, so if Sheffield and Leeds introduce something, where do the diesel vehicles go? Do they move to the Republic of Ireland and or do they just move somewhere else in Yorkshire, or do they stay in the fleet? So that second-hand migration is quite an interesting forecasting challenge, basically. Moving swiftly on, COVID. Then we had lovely business cases for our various clean air zones that we're working on, and then suddenly COVID came in and it has disrupted the appetite for introducing penalties on local industries and local vehicle owners. And there is the aim to build on the new coming out in the new normal or whatever, but still there is more of a reluctance to charge than there was before COVID. So there's a bit of a re-examination of that in terms of what has COVID done, but we're very much not interested in what it's done during lockdown. We're trying to predict what it will do beyond COVID, if that's ever a place we can get to. So in particular, it's the idea is that vaccines are widely available, social distancing is a thing of the past, but there will still be effects that are that need to be taken account of in the emissions modelling, basically. So we identified by analysis of what was causing the emissions at the minute, and we identified 10 effects, long-lasting effects of COVID that need to be taken account of in the emissions modelling. So the first one is that 6 months of business as usual fleet will be lost, have already been lost, and will continue to be lost going forward. So by the time we get to 2022, the fleet is 6 months older than it would have been when we last thought about it, because people have not had the chance or the finances or the enthusiasm to upgrade just under normal business as usual fleet replacement. There's a likelihood to be a long-term change in mode choice, so more active travel and less public transport use, potentially feeding into potentially more bus and taxi use, which adds to emissions if the buses are still running empty. So there's a double edge to that one. Commuting reduced due to more working from home, so that's a behavioural change. Reduced commuting because you don't have a job to go to, which is the economic impact on the COVID's impact on the economy. So that you don't have unemployment rises and therefore commuting falls. Business travel down because of virtual meetings like this, rather than going to rooms full of people. And moving on to the next set, business travel due to economic downturn, again, people not with no jobs to go to a business meeting for, basically. And then there's all the other trips that were creating pollution into city centres, so leisure, getting your hair done, shop, whatever, as well as and retail. And then there's a behavioural one, which is home shopping. So you're still shopping, but you're now doing it from home, but then that generates more van deliveries. So that's an interesting double-edged one. And then if the bus companies get bored running empty buses, is there a change to the bus services? So does that just wipe out an entire operator because they go bust, or does it affect the lightly used services? And if so, is that a good thing from an emissions point of view or a bad thing? All to be determined by the local circumstances. And then the sort of places for people type initiatives to take away road space, are they going to become permanent? And is there any other big developments that you've been modelling that are now not happening or delayed that you need to take out of your traffic model? So all of that, if you put all of that together, we argued that there was too many to model each one in turn and all combinations of them. So we've come up with a scenario-based approach where we put them together in different groups. And we're not saying that necessarily we know the best guess. There's a lot of uncertainty, but you can still model different scenarios and say it could be this or it could be that. And you identify the scenarios that might happen and then try and avoid the ones you don't want to happen, rather than just having a single best guess of what post-COVID looks like. And we think there's some merit in distinguishing behavioural change from economic impacts, and there's some merit in considering what policy might do to that. And there's a lot of, basically the last point, there's a lot of overlap between what the policy could do and the comms that might go with that as part of the scheme to get a better new normal than the old normal. And where we've got to at the minute in some of the cities, and some places we've tested individual COVID impact one by one, but generally we're putting them together in combinations. So that the sugar cube on the right is trying to illustrate that we have scenarios that are economic impacts on their own, behavioural change impacts on their own, policy interventions applied to those, and then various combinations of that with sexy names. And we're using those to sort of try and understand how COVID will affect air quality, or more particularly emissions. And it's, again, we're very much thinking beyond the direct impacts of COVID. It's the long-lasting things forward to 2022. So that was a bit of a gallop through. My sort of final slides are a quote, obviously many have heard this. So all of this is modelling. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So just because you don't know what the future is doesn't say that you can't get insight from models. And obviously you do have to spend a bit on models. You can't just knock a model up with no data and no effort. So the better your model, the more you put into it in advance, the better the forecasts and the predictions will be that come from that modelling. And uncertainty is not a reason not to model things, and in fact it's an encouragement to do more modelling, because actually it allows you to look at the various different possibilities rather than having just the business as usual, which you don't really need to model for. You can just say, well, that's what it has looked like. So the more uncertain the future is, the more you need a model, in my opinion. And finally, just emissions modelling. It's great fun. If you haven't tried it, contact me and we'll encourage you to do more of it, because it's a useful application of a combination of mathematics and behaviour and data analysis to predict the future as best we can. And that's it. Any questions?
Thanks, David. I would question emissions modelling being the best one you can have your clothes on. I'm a chemist. Much better being in the lab. Much better. Okay, so there is one question comes in the chat, and or one comment comes in the chat, and it's to do with charges. And do any of the charges go to support additional clean air initiatives such as cycle lanes? Are you aware of that?
Have I still got the mic? Yes. A lot of the cost is just, or the charge will just go to running the scheme, which is therefore is not a great benefit. And again, in the timescales that we're talking about, you can't do anything meaningful with the money in the timescale that you need to get compliant. So effectively, it is just a transfer of money from the motorist. And the ideal is that it doesn't generate any money, that everybody upgrades their vehicle as quickly as possible. So the less money it generates, the better. But it would be the case that that money is used to fund measures, but we're very much not in the job of funding things with that money within the 2-year timescales that we're talking about. So it is generally authorities are not being encouraged down south to have big plans for what they do with that money, because the idea is that money will tail off very quickly as the fleet becomes compliant, basically, and therefore you shouldn't be using it. Unlike things like workplace levies, where you'd be using an ongoing stream to pay for the measures, the tram system or the encouraging 20-minute neighbourhoods or whatever. So it's not a money-making scheme. It's a stick to get the fleet to improve, get it sorted out where possible into something cleaner. So it's not a money-making adventure.
Okay, and what I'm going to do just now then is I've got a couple of questions that could go to the full group. So if Carly, Thomas, and if John from EP Scotland can jump in for a couple of these questions, it would be good. John is just put a message on the chat after David's talk saying it's good to hear about the specialist knowledge on fleet developments and the work going on to develop low emission zones in Scotland and clean air zones in England as they try to deal with the changes due to travel and working lives in a possible COVID-19 world. It's going to be tricky to predict, and will people going to go to work or stay at home or go back to work with some days of the week? So I think that's going to be a big deal, and I suppose that would then fit into the 20-minute cities. So I'm going to pass over to Thomas if you want to comment on that kind of aspect.
Yeah, I think we are undoubtedly going to see the change in the way that people work, and there was a big push a while back from Boris to get people back to work, to reinvigorate those local economies around business districts. But as we change, when we're starting to work, that further emphasizes the need for these 20-minute neighborhoods where we're catering for those people who are working at home and they're contributing to their local economies. So I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to adapt to as we go to this new way of working.
Absolutely.
It's got benefits for the economy as well, hasn't it?
It does. Well,
local
I think
shops,
it's going to, local shops. But local shops in town centre, city centres in Glasgow, Paisley, for instance, are going to suffer from the lack of us going into the office, whereas our local shops might benefit from that.
But I think that's also, again, about trying to move people back into city centres as well, where we've seen migration of communities away from city centres is also then building our city centres so people can come back in as well. High density is the most sustainable way of living. And I think the biggest problem I see in this is those people who are working from home on new developments that haven't embraced any kind of progressive thinking around cycling and walking. They'll be the people that will have to go and drive somewhere to go and get their lunch, their shopping.
Well, I live in a new development, and if I didn't have my car, it's a 45-minute walk to the city, the town centre. It's also a 15-minute walk to the closest shop. There's a 1 bus an hour. So your topic that the cars should be guests it's never going to happen to retrofit. I think David, you talked about retrofitting developments, but I don't think that's feasible at the moment from my point of view.
Well, I would disagree. You can do an awful lot, which in terms of local decent shops that you get locally, start with that and make sure that your GP your whole health board doesn't centralize all the health facilities in a big, easy to run if you're a health board, but not easy to get to if you're a patient. So you can do step-by-step stuff. You don't have to wait to a new development, because the snag we wait for new developments is it's just nibbling away at the overall travel demand or whatever. So you do need to think of how the retrofitting will be applied to areas where there are no shops. Well, that's quite easy. You can set aside a building and make it a good local with everything you need type shop that you can walk to in 5 minutes, not 15.
Yeah.
I think also there's one of the key concepts of the 20-minute neighborhood is also having that easy access to public transport. And I think that could be a first good step in kind of retrofitting the concept into developments where they don't have that. Is actually, well, in that case, we're going to make sure you've got really easy access, really strong public transport to get you to the places where you can get the things you need.
Yeah.
And just on the balance of not, what proportion of people will work from home and how often will they work from home and stuff, we're caught a little bit because we can't be over-egging that, because we then get accused of not having to try hard enough on the CAS, because we've predicted that the demand will be, everybody working from home and therefore not another car to be seen. So we're torn between overestimating that and underestimating, because if you overestimate it, you end up not needing to introduce the measure that makes car use or old dirty diesel use in general, not just cars. You take your eye off that because you're relying on COVID to solve the problem. So we're trying not to fall into that trap.
One of the other problems with getting people try to work from home is digital hardship, which finding a little bit have the infrastructure in your house to actually have a decent broadband, so that there's not 5 people trying to connect to the one router and things. That
and the space to work as well. So, we have the luxury of a room that you can go into, and whoever else have other colleagues with young kids, and you're that they're in the bedroom or on the kitchen table, etc., etc. So just having the luxury of space as well as broadband is not something everyone has.
Absolutely. I've had a comment saying that we need to move to a culture of sustainable mobility and away from car ownership and use, which is absolutely correct, which fits in with what we've all been saying today. One of the comments I thought we could discuss as a group here was that it's been great to have an update on Scotland's progress and success, and how do we think we can build on the collaboration with others in the lead up to and during COP26, which is happening next year now. John, do you want to start kicking us off with that one?
Well, that's obviously it's going to be hugely important, especially as it's been delayed by a year because of the pandemic. We're a year closer to that 2030 deadline for the global warming predictions of what will happen if we don't achieve 1.5 degrees centigrade above, if we go above that, above pre-industrial levels. So it's going to be hugely important. And I think it's important the Scottish governments and the UK governments and internationally, people focus on this and not use the COVID pandemic as a distraction to say we can't implement improvements to air quality, emissions, and ensure there's a real deal comes out of this. It's been really unfortunate this year that a lot of the momentum I felt that happened last year with the climate change protests instigated by the Greta Thunberg school strike, it's been lost a little bit. It's gone to social media, which is a great thing as well, because you can always reach out to people. But those mass strikes where young people were coming together, walking through the cities of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Inverness, I think some of that's been lost. So we need to get that momentum back and ensure that we don't use COVID as an excuse to not push ahead with some really ambitious policies. But the Scottish government is doing its bit. It's got the Climate Change Act that was set very, very ambitious 2045 net zero targets for Scotland. So I think we're fortunate it's happening in a country where they have set very high standards and a very high bar for themselves. There's a lot of work to do. On the electric vehicle side, maybe that's something David wants to talk about, the 2032 target. I think the UK government are now talking about 2030. So that's maybe an issue as well.
So David, you in your talk said sales were up from 4% to 16% of electric vehicles?
Yeah, of new sales. Obviously, it still takes a while to get into the fleet, but yes, and that's alternatively fuel vehicles. So that's both hybrid and battery electric or whatever. So yeah, it is quite accelerating now. And if you look at the adverts for cars, you don't see many cars, many car manufacturers advertising diesel cars at the minute, or even ordinary petrol. It's all hybrid and battery. And trying to explain to the public what the difference is, the things that are more or less good, but trying to make them all sound good. So I think it is very much moving that way. But whether that is, I very much take the point that an electric car is still a car, basically. So I would need to avoid thinking that technology will solve, particularly climate, because I think the air quality will solve reasonably well over the next couple of years, just with the improvement. But the carbon fossil fuel problem will not be solved if we just switch everything to electric, because you can still have congestion and still have particulate emissions from tires and brakes. So it's need to avoid the electric car is the solution. But it's very much, from an air quality point of view, it's definitely had the new fleet is a lot cleaner than the old one. And that's
Sure.
even before you add in the Euro 6 better than Euro 4.
Yeah,
just on sorry, Thomas.
Just on the electric sort of fleet point, I think there's definitely place for it. But one area that we quite focus on is that last mile logistics and that commercial sort of delivery vans, etc. And as we know, there's such high demand, even more so now. You know, Bezos is a third richer than he was before COVID, but that's one of the biggest impacts on air quality in our cities. And when we're looking at last mile logistics for Sustrans, for us, that means focusing on getting to depot centers and utilizing cargo bites or similar to do that last mile. But it's very hard to get local authorities to commit to future-proofing infrastructure to cater for cargo bikes, where at the moment, cargo bikes maybe aren't that common, getting more and more common. For very rarely do you see them doing deliveries, but if we say, well, let's future-proof this piece of infrastructure for the next 20 years and actually make it wide enough to cater for a cargo bike, or future-proof that parking station there to make it so there's parking for cargo bikes, it's very hard to get traction with that idea.
Yeah. And I think somebody just commented, Ademi has just posted that that research suggests that despite 65% reduction of our vehicles on the roads during lockdown, particulate matter concentrations just changed little. So we should be worried about indoor emissions and indoor air quality. And with a lot of us working, which is going to be the new norm. So you're absolutely correct. We do need to start thinking about, but that could be a different webinar. So I'll suggest that to Carly, to Claire and John and Elena to organise a webinar on indoor air quality.
And just as well, in terms of things I would like to hear, I would quite like SEPA's describing what they're doing in their air quality modelling, because obviously they've done a lot of work in the low emission zone stuff. So I think it'd be quite useful for a set of SEPA presentations on low emission zones and air quality modelling in general, I guess. If I would be interested in that, even if no one else is.
David's commenting that the biggest domestic combustion is the biggest overall contribution, but secondary sources involving ammonia from agriculture. I think that was something Carly was looking at, especially because the areas that the breadth project are looking at are semi-rural, which takes in kind of agricultural areas. Carly, do you have anything you want to mention on that?
You're on mute, Carly. All right.
Sorry. So yeah, it could be definitely could be an important area to look at, especially with the production of NO2 and the cycling with pollutants in that sense. In terms of, I mean, we didn't see anything. We had particulate matter samples that we were trying to get during this time, but unfortunately, due to the restrictions on movement, we weren't able to look at that data. So that was something that we were hoping to try and get to see if that had changed or if it hadn't. But we unfortunately don't have that data.
Thanks, Carly. A question from Alan to. I'm sorry, John. John Richard. I missed his. He's talking about silver bullets, hydrogen vehicles. Are they silver bullets or are a distraction? Who wants to go for that?
They should be given as much space as electric vehicles and possibly more because of the ability to do things with them, and particularly for the heavier vehicles. So I think the electric is going to struggle for the longer distance, and you still will need longer distance freight vehicles and whatever. So I would say, and buses also. So I would say hydrogen needs maybe more consideration than it's getting in the short term, and I think it could well be a significant chunk for the heavy duty engine market of vehicles, which will still need to exist and could well work better with a combination of hydrogen and possibly biomethane type technology than electric. Which, and not least because of the amount of embedded carbon that goes into a big battery and electric vehicles and stuff, that you have a lot less of that for the hydrogen cells.
It's where we get this lithium from as well. It's being mined, so that's got environmental problems. We need to look at that.
Yeah. So I would say hydrogen is a good thing and should be on the list of things to be worked towards.
So David, you're up again, I'm afraid. Lots of questions for David. In SEPA, we found the emission factor toolkit predicted fleets to be overly optimistic for future years in terms of the Euro classes, with the recent reduction in diesel sales, which is going to tend to feed into the overall fleet, it's not considered in the EFT future predictions. The fleet will be quite different in the future, but how will this affect emissions predictions? And will the EFT emission predictions be more realistic, but for the wrong underlying fleet?
My advice would be just don't use the EFT. It's so far behind because the fleet, certainly new sales, is changing so rapidly that by the time they've got a new version of the emissions factor toolkit, it's out of date. So we use ANPR data for what the traffic is on the road in Dundee or wherever it might be, or Sheffield or wherever, and then calibrate a fleet model that takes that, applies scrappage to it at the older end, and rolls forward in years from that current fleet. And that's quite often quite different from the EFT default for the UK or UK outside London or whatever. So I would suggest ANPR, local fleet calibrated, a fleet model, and then roll that forward with the ability to play tunes on with CAS or without CAS affecting that.
So if people see, I'm trying to see who's raised their hand. Anybody's raised their hand? Alec McLean, have you raised your hand, or was it a question that's been answered already?
I think the question's been answered already. I was going to ask if there was any future for diesel cars, given the EU constantly improve the regulations, but I think David really answered that with electric cars as well. Thanks.
Okay. In that case, then, if there's no further questions, I'm just going to, I'll let the speaker switch off. First of all, I'm going to thank Rosanna Cunningham, Thomas, David, and Carly for doing their presentations. There's a little reaction button down the bottom that gives them a round of applause. So I'm going to give them a virtual round of applause for doing it. So thank you very much. If you can do the same. I also would like to thank Claire, Elena, and John for setting up EP Scotland's very first webinar, and I think it has went remarkably well. If you get any follow-up questions, feel free to email the team. I'm going to put the email address in the chat function, and if you get any further questions about this, you can follow up with them, and I'm sure they will be able to help. A reminder that there are 2 other sessions coming up, one on the 18th of November, and that's Better Places for Public Health. And then there's one in December called Green and Natural Places, and the date of that has still to be confirmed. But you'll get the dates on the EPS newsletter, which will come to you at some point. So if the speakers could stay on for a couple of minutes after everybody's left, I would just want to thank you all for attending today, for your input and your discussion, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye. There we go. I take it, Claire, that other Claire's you. You're on mute.
Mute, Claire.
Yes, the other Claire is me. That is the one I was watching. I had it on my other. It went very, very, very well.
Thank you, guys. That did. You did well.
Was,
Thomas, if I called you Richard during any time, because I've been calling you Richard in my head all day, and I don't know why I've been calling you Richard. So apologies if I called you Richard during that.
Yeah, I forgot to press record. It was only when you said we're recording it that I remembered. So the first part of your presentation, Ian, or your introduction is missing. But I've recorded that.
That was really good. I thought the video was excellent.